Hello and welcome to your daily word.
Hello and welcome back. I'm Pastor David. And today we're going to look at a few verses from Colossians chapter 3, beginning at verse 1. If then you were raised with Christ, seek those things which are above, where Christ is, sitting at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things above, not on the things on the earth. For you died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. Here the Apostle Paul is speaking to the Colossians to remind them that if you are born again, if you have been saved by Jesus Christ, by believing in his death, he says, you were raised with Christ. That means we've been made alive in Christ to walk in newness of life. He says then we are to seek those things which are above where Christ is, sitting the right hand of God. I believe that the Apostle Paul is telling us that when we become a believer, our priorities get totally rearranged. So much of our life is spent looking and living for self. And we lived in a world where all we thought was to find those things that would make us happy, to find those things that would give us pleasure, to find those things that would satisfy us. And we looked exclusively here in this world. We worked for the things that would fulfill our desires, the things that would make us feel good about ourselves. But God says now that we have been risen in Christ, now that we have this new life in Jesus, and his Spirit is empowering us, then we need to look to those things that are above, the heavenly things that are where Christ is seated. What are the heavenly things? Well, we think of the glories of God. We think of the power of God. We think of the mercies of God, the grace of God. We think of the nature of God. We think about the character of God. We are to seek after those things and look after those things. He says in verse 2, set your mind on things above, not on things on the earth. Wow, what a contrast that is. We are to set our mind. He's saying we need to establish that the priority in our life is no longer for the earthly things. He's not saying that we don't need clothing. He's not saying we don't need food and shelter. He's not saying that we don't need rest or a place to live or enjoyment in life. No, he's not saying all of that. But what he is saying is that where our focus is, where we set our mind, is on those things that are above, the heavenly things. Why? Because we've died in Christ Jesus. When Christ died on the cross and we put our faith in him, God has seen us as though we died with Christ on the cross of Calvary. Therefore, our old nature has died in Christ Jesus. And now there is a new nature living in us, and we need to set the mind of that new man in Christ on the heavenly things. I think that is a call for each and every believer to examine himself. To look at what are the priorities of my life? Where do I spend my time? Where do I spend my money? Where do I give of my efforts? So much of our time and money and efforts are spent on earthly things. And while he won't deny that we need some of those things, the focus of our life needs to be upon the spiritual things. Somebody has said if you could read a man's checkbook, you can tell where his heart is. For where his treasure is, there will his heart be, Jesus said. And yes, and I believe that is true today for you and for me, that if we were to look where we spend our money, if we would look where we spend our time, it speaks volumes about what is the focus of our life. And I think when I think about my own life, there have been times when my focus was not on the heavenly things. Going to church on Sunday once a week doesn't mean that I have a heavenly focus. But do I value prayer? Do I value seeking God? Do I value loving God and worshiping God Do I do it for 1 hour a week, or do I spend my life as an act of worship for God? Do I live my life loving others as God would have me love them? So many areas where my life must be focused on the heavenly goals, on the heavenly objectives, manifesting the nature of God and the character of God in my life through Jesus Christ. I would encourage you today, in your quiet time with God, maybe reflect on these few verses and on your mind. Is it set on the things above? Maybe it's just a time to check in and reflect. Or maybe there's a time to make some readjustments. Seek the Lord. Allow Him to speak to you today.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Come back tomorrow for the next Daily Word. God bless.